5 years ago, she saved up $38,000. Her father took every last cent and bought her brother a house. Today, the family home is slated for demolition. The buyout offer, $950,000. Her brother called, voice thick with tears. Dad had a stroke. He says the money, you deserve a share. She flew across the ocean with her Nordic husband and their daughter. At the airport, she spotted a brand new gold watch on her brother's wrist. $4,500. That was the fair share they had set aside for her. Then she walked into the demolition office and laid her own proposal on the table. Some people use family as a knife, stabbing you again and again, betting you'll keep bleeding in silence. She just smiled. This time, she was no one's silent sister. Iris stared at the balance alert on her phone. The instant noodles had gone cold, a pale scum of grease congealing on the surface. She didn't move. Her eyes stayed locked on that number. $41,200. 5 years of overtime. 5 years of skipped lunches, unbought clothes, missed dinners with colleagues who stopped inviting her after the 10th polite refusal. 5 years of her 20s, compressed into a string of digits sitting motionless in a checking account. 12,000 more, and she'd have enough for a down payment. The call came at 10 at night. Her father's voice traveled 1,000 miles, carrying the damp, earthy smell of her hometown. Iris, the roof is leaking again. The rain's been brutal this year. Your mother's bedroom wall is peeling off in sheets. The contractor says the whole thing needs replacing. Minimum, $11,000. Iris's hand hovered over her drawing tablet, a logo design she'd revised 7 times still waiting to be submitted. Dad, didn't I just send $700 last month? $700. That barely covers. Your brother needed a new phone and... Silence. Someone on the other end had covered the receiver. She could hear her mother's voice in the background, a low, urgent murmur. Then Robert cleared his throat, and when he spoke again, his voice had settled back into that familiar weary father tone, the one that always made her feel like a debtor calling to negotiate terms. Dad knows it's not easy for you. But the family's stretched thin. Your brother just switched jobs, money's tight. You're the older sister. If you don't help, who will? Older sister. Those 2 words had been branded onto her forehead since the day her brother was born. Liam broke a bowl. Why didn't his sister watch him? Liam failed a test. Why didn't his sister tutor him? When Liam needed tuition for college, she had just started her first job with $800 in her account. The phone call came before her first paycheck cleared. Asterisk, your brother's tuition is short. An older sister helps out. It's only right, asterisk. She ate nothing but noodles for a month and wired over $1,400. Later came the girlfriend, the car, the new phone. Every time, your brother needs a little help. When she mentioned she wanted to enroll in an online certification course, Robert's voice came through the line flat and final. Asterisk, why does a girl need more school? Save your money. You'll get married someday, asterisk. She didn't save. She worked double shifts, took triple the freelance gigs, sat in front of her computer at 4 in the morning rubbing her burning eyes. Dollar by dollar, she built that $41,000. But the someday, in her father's logic, didn't include a mortgage. In Robert's world, a daughter buying her own apartment was an absurdity, almost an act of rebellion. Asterisk, housing is the man's responsibility. Why are you worrying about things that aren't your concern, asterisk? She hung up and wired the $11,000 anyway. Last time, she told herself. Fix the roof, then focus on the down payment. A week later, the phone rang again. Her mother's voice came through, thin and brittle as an autumn leaf. Iris. Mom's been having chest pains. The clinic says it might be a heart problem. They want me to go to a bigger hospital for tests. Your father says, with the deposit and the tests, it'll be at least this much. $14,000. Iris gripped the phone until her knuckles went white. She borrowed from her college roommate. Hit up 2 coworkers. Drained the last of her own savings. Along with the $11,000 from the week before, 5 years of sacrifice vanished in 2 phone calls. 3 days later she called to ask about the test results. Robert hemmed and hawed for a long moment before muttering, "It's nothing. High blood pressure." They gave her some pills. Iris sat very still. Dad. $14,000. For high blood pressure. What's that supposed to mean? Robert's voice spiked, defensive and sharp. Your mother wasn't feeling well. What's wrong with getting checked out? You spend a little money and suddenly it's a problem. Do you have any idea how much we spent raising you? She didn't answer. She hung up, sat at her desk, and stared at her screen. The client's 12th round of revision requests glowed back at her. A notification popped up in the corner, rent deducted. Balance, $320. Debt, $9,000. She put her head down on her keyboard. Her shoulders shook, soundlessly, for a long time. A coworker asked if she was okay. She lifted her head, wiped her eyes, and said, "Fine. Allergies." Then she went to the mall. She'd meant to buy a pair of sneakers. Her old ones had holes worn through the soles. When it rained, water seeped in and her toes went numb and white. She circled the athletic section twice, picked up a pair on clearance, put them back. She was heading downstairs to the supermarket to grab a pair of canvas slip-ons for $7 when she saw him. Liam. More precisely, she saw the bag first. The woman standing next to him was carrying it, new collection. Iris recognized it from a client's ad campaign. $1,700, retail. Liam was holding a gold chain up against the woman's collarbone, admiring it in the department store mirror. The saleswoman hovered nearby, all smiles and deference, calling him Mr. Chen. The watch on his wrist, she clocked the logo instantly. That alone was 3 months of her salary. His shoes gleamed. His jacket was current season. Shopping bags crowded his feet, each logo bigger than the last. Iris. He spotted her first. His face cycled through surprise, a flash of panic, and then settled into a kind of hardened nonchalance, edged with irritation. What are you doing here? Mom's sick. She heard her own voice as if from very far away. The $14,000. For Mom's tests. Where is it? Before Liam could answer, the woman beside him rolled her eyes and muttered under her breath, "Here for money again." Liam's expression flickered. He shifted his body, angling himself between Iris and the woman, and when he spoke, his voice carried that particular impatience she'd heard 1,000 times growing up, the impatience of the favored child interrupted. What's with the interrogation? Mom's medical bills got paid. What do you think happened to the money? What happened to it? Iris took a step forward. She didn't raise her voice, but Liam retreated half a step anyway. That watch is worth $1,100, minimum. Her bag, $1,700 retail. And you just swiped a card for a gold chain. I saw it. So tell me, Liam. What exactly is Mom sick with? The woman rolled her eyes again, harder this time, and tugged at Liam's arm. Let's go. Don't waste your breath. She's just jealous. Something flickered across Liam's face, the irritation of being exposed, a flash of something almost like shame. But it vanished fast, replaced by that old, easy arrogance, the kind only a son raised without consequences could wear so comfortably. All right. Don't make a scene. If you've got something to say it at home. He was already turning away, pulling the woman with him. Then he paused and looked back over his shoulder, a tight, almost gleeful edge in his voice. Oh, by the way, Mom and Dad want you home tomorrow. Something important. What? He was already a dozen steps away. He didn't turn around. His hand lifted in a dismissive wave, and his voice floated back, carrying a note of something she couldn't quite place. You'll find out. Trust me, you'll want to hear it. She didn't wait until tomorrow. She booked the overnight train. 14 hours, hard seat. The carriage rattled and swayed through the darkness, reeking of instant noodles and sweat and the particular exhaustion of people traveling on money they couldn't afford to spend. She leaned her forehead against the cold, trembling window. Outside, the occasional light flickered past like a falling star. She arrived at the county station at 5 in the morning. The sky was just beginning to pale. She sat on the steps outside the station for 2 hours, watching the town wake up, the breakfast stalls firing up their grills, the early commuters pedaling past on rusted bicycles, the street sweepers pushing their wide brooms across the asphalt. She waited for the sun to rise, and for the thing churning in her chest to settle into something she could name. At 7:30, she knocked on the door of her childhood home. Robert was crouched in the courtyard, brushing his teeth. White foam around his mouth, he looked up, startled, then frowned. What are you doing here so early? You didn't even call. Margaret leaned out from the kitchen doorway, flour on her apron, spatula in hand. The expression on her face was more complicated than Robert's: surprise, yes, panic at the edges, and something else. Something Iris couldn't quite read. Iris? Have you eaten breakfast? Mom. She stood at the gate. She didn't step inside. Are you feeling better? Margaret's face went rigid. Her eyes darted toward Robert. Robert spat out the toothpaste, wiped his mouth on his sleeve, and stood. His voice was low, but it carried the authority it had always carried in this house. Come inside. Don't stand in the doorway making a scene. I'm not coming in. Her voice was calm. Eerily calm. Even she barely recognized it. I just have one question. My $41,000. Where is it? The courtyard went silent. A neighbor's dog barked twice. Birds rustled in the jujube tree. In the kitchen, oil still sizzled in the wok, but Margaret stood frozen, the spatula suspended midair. Robert held her gaze. His jaw worked side to side. Then he spoke. Bought your brother a house. 6 words. Flat. Casual. As if he were remarking on the weather. Iris stood in the gateway. Behind her, the morning sun was climbing, its warmth spreading across her shoulders. She felt none of it. What did you say? Your brother's getting married. You can't get married without a house. Prices around here have shot up, a down payment alone is over 30 grand. That 41 of yours, plus what we scraped together, bought a place outright. In your brother's name. Robert spoke with something approaching righteousness, as if he were explaining a principle so obvious only a fool would question it. You're the older sister. You help your brother. That's how it works. Besides, he waved a hand, dismissive, you're a girl. You work in some city, someday you'll get married and belong to someone else's family. What do you need a house for? Your brother is different. He's the root of the Chen family. He carries the name. Iris watched his mouth move, the yellowed teeth, the flecks of spittle catching the morning light. She felt like she was watching a stranger, a tired actor on a shabby stage, reciting lines from a play that should have closed years ago. That was 5 years of my money, she said. Her voice was quiet. But the courtyard went still again. Your money. Robert set down his enamel mug. His voice dropped, thickening with warning. The food you ate growing up, the clothes on your back, whose money paid for that? Who paid your college tuition? Who supported you when you were job hunting after graduation? Now you've got wings and you want to settle accounts with me. Tuition. A laugh escaped her, harsher than a sob. Dad, I paid for college with loans and part-time jobs. I sent money home every month, $70, because you said Liam needed tutoring. My first year working, I lived in a basement, made $500 a month, and sent home $200. Did you ever, once, say thank you? Robert's face flooded red. Not with guilt. With the particular rage of a man whose authority has been challenged in front of an audience. You, his finger jabbed toward her, trembling. You ungrateful little, I raised you for 20 years, and this is how you settle accounts. I'm not settling accounts, Dad. Her voice was still calm, but her eyes had begun to burn. I just want to know. You took everything I had. You didn't even ask. What gave you the right? I'm your father. Robert's palm slammed the stone table. The enamel mug jumped, rolled, hit the ground. Tea splashed across the paving stones. Let me tell you something, Iris. This is my house. My rules. The money's been spent. The contract's been signed. The deed's in your brother's name. You can scream all you want, it's done. You don't like it? Take me to court. See how far that gets you. Iris. Margaret's voice finally emerged, trembling. Don't fight with your father. The money, it was my idea. I told him to take it. Liam's girlfriend, she's pregnant. Without a house, her family won't let them marry. I didn't know what else to do. You didn't know what else to do. Iris turned to face her mother. The tears she'd been holding back finally slipped free, cutting hot tracks down her cheeks. Mom. You faked an illness. You lied to me. Was that also not knowing what else to do? The blood drained from Margaret's face. Her mouth opened. Closed. No sound came out. Iris looked at her mother's white-streaked hair, at her father's furious, mottled face, at the jujube tree she'd climbed 1,000 times as a child. The whole scene felt like a faded photograph, and she was standing outside the frame, separated from the people inside by a distance no bridge could span. Fine. She lifted a hand, wiped her face, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone still. Still as a frozen lake. Keep the money. Robert's eyes flickered with something that looked almost like triumph. But not as a gift. Her voice cut through. As a lesson. She turned and walked away. Behind her, Robert's roar filled the alleyway. Walk out that door and don't come back. As far as I'm concerned, I have no daughter. She paused. She didn't turn around. Her voice floated back, clear and calm. Fine. You don't. She walked out of the alleyway. The sun had fully risen now, pouring white light over the rooftops. She squinted into it and forced the tears back, one by one, until her eyes were dry. Then she pulled out her phone and typed a single line into her notes. Asterisk, remember this, Iris. You don't have a family anymore, asterisk. She never went back. She didn't delete their numbers. She just stopped dialing. Robert called twice. Once, half a year later, asking if she could help Liam with a down payment on a car. She hung up and turned her phone off for 2 days. The second time, a year after that, Margaret called, crying, saying she missed her. Iris listened in silence, said, "Take care of yourself," and hung up. Liam sent a text, asterisk, "Mom and Dad are getting old. Stop being so dramatic, asterisk." She replied with a single word, "No." Then she blocked him. She buried herself in work. In that cramped rented room in the city, she sat through countless 4 a.m. hours, freelancing, studying English, rebuilding her portfolio from scratch. She took Liam's gold chain, her father's roar, her mother's tears, and she ground them down fine, swallowed them like crushed glass, and transformed them into line after line on her tablet, draft after draft on her screen. She didn't allow herself to stop. Because if she stopped, the abyss was waiting. That abyss had a name, the older sister's fate. 2 years later, the offer letter came. A design studio in Helsinki. Small, boutique, internationally regarded. The day she picked up her visa, she passed a jewelry store and stopped. Through the glass, a display of gold chains glinted under track lighting. She stood there for a long moment, remembering another display case in another city, another lifetime. She didn't go in. She walked into the bank next door and wired one last sum to her mother's account. $1,400. The memo line was blank. No message. No message needed. Like cutting away necrotic tissue. Clean. Sharp. Final. The plane touched down at Helsinki-Vantaa in the early morning. The air hit her like a blade, cold and impossibly clean, carrying the scent of pine and lake water. She wheeled her single suitcase out of the terminal and stood still for a moment, breathing in that sharp, clarifying cold. She'd cut her hair short. Dyed it a darker shade. On her passport, her Chinese name sat beneath a string of English letters. New colleagues called her Iris. No one knew the name belonged to a girl who'd been hollowed out and left for empty. Nordic winters were long and dark. She found she didn't mind them. There was something honest about that kind of cold. It didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. She was reborn there. Not in fire. In ice. 7 years passed. She was in the garden with her daughter, Hilda, picking apples. The autumn light fell thick and golden through the branches, and Hilda's laughter rang like a bell. Eric leaned out from the garage, her phone in his upraised hand. Iris. Phone. From China. She stood on the ladder, an apple in each hand, and looked down at the screen in her husband's grip. +86. The country code for China. The number wasn't saved. The last time she'd seen that prefix was 7 years ago, when Margaret called, weeping, saying she missed her. After that, silence. Hilda, perched on her shoulders, asked in her bright, curious voice, "Mama, who is it?" Iris didn't answer. She climbed down carefully, handed Hilda to Eric, and took the phone. She walked to the far end of the garden, into the dappled shadow of the apple tree, and pressed the answer button. Iris. The voice came through across 7 years of silence and 5,000 miles of ocean. Urgent. Tearful. And underneath the tears, That cloying, wheedling note she'd heard 1,000 times growing up, the note that only entered Liam's voice when he wanted something. "Iris, it's me. Liam. Please, please don't hang up. Just listen. Please." She said nothing. She leaned against the rough bark of the apple tree and watched Eric spin Hilda in circles on the lawn. Their daughter's laughter floated across the grass. "Iris." Liam's voice dropped, taking on a complexity she'd never heard from him before, something between resentment and the desperation of a man clutching at his last rope. "The old house. It's being demolished. The buyout, $950,000. He paused, waiting for a reaction. She didn't give him one. "And Dad." His voice cracked, the tears suddenly sounding realer, though with Liam, the line between performance and feeling had always been blurry. "Dad had a stroke. Last month. The whole left side of his body, he can't move it. He can't talk. Just makes these sounds. And Mom," her blood pressure spiked so high she almost didn't make it. His voice trailed off, then came back smaller, carrying a note she had never once, in her entire life, heard in her brother's voice. Humility. Or something close to it. The particular smallness of someone who has spent years building a fortress of entitlement, only to watch it collapse around him. "Iris, I know. I know the family did you wrong. But Dad, he's lying in that hospital bed, and the only word we can make out, the only name he keeps saying, it's yours. I think he's sorry." She watched Hilda chase a rabbit-shaped plush toy across the grass. "The relocation office says all registered family members have to sign off. If you don't come back, the money won't be released. Dad, he had someone change the agreement. He said you deserve a share." Liam's voice dropped to almost a whisper, cracked and raw. "Come home. Please." She hung up. Eric walked over, carrying Hilda's half-finished juice cup. He didn't ask who it was. He just stood beside her, quiet, watching the apple trees with her. She had learned, over their years together, that this was his way. The Finnish way, she'd come to think of it. No prying. No pressing. Just presence. A steady, unhurried silence that said, "I'm here. When you're ready, I'm here, I need to go back," she said finally. Eric turned to look at her. His eyes, the color of forest lakes under cloud, rested on her face without demand. "Not for forgiveness," she said, her gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the garden fence. "For an ending. They owe me an answer. 7 years of silence, and I'm still carrying a question I didn't realize I was asking. I don't want Hilda to grow up and ask where her mother came from, and all I can show her is a passport with the first pages torn out." 3 days later, their plane touched down. Liam was waiting at the arrival's gate with his wife, Chloe. For a moment, Iris didn't recognize him. The cocky, label-draped boy she remembered was gone. The man standing before her was paunchy, balding, draped in a pilled sweater and scuffed leather shoes. The 8,000 yuan watch had vanished from his wrist, replaced by a cheap fitness tracker with a scratched face. His eyes had the hooded, restless look of someone who hadn't slept well in a long time. And Chloe. The girl who'd rolled her eyes at her in the mall, who'd tugged at Liam's arm and said your sister's just jealous, she stood beside him now in a coat that was clearly expensive once, several seasons ago, her makeup heavy, unable to hide the fine lines around her eyes or the tight, nervous energy radiating from her like heat off asphalt. Iris. Liam's smile stretched wide as he rushed forward, hands reaching for Eric's suitcase. Eric didn't let go. Liam's hands hung in the air, suspended between reach and retreat. He pivoted toward Iris, the smile resetting itself by force of will. "And this must be your husband. And oh my God, look at my niece, she's like a little princess. She's shy." Iris shifted her body, blocking his hand as it reached for Hilda. Her voice was level. Neutral. The voice you'd use with a stranger asking for directions. Liam's smile flickered. Chloe stepped in smoothly, her voice dripping saccharine. "Sis, you must be exhausted. The car's outside, let's get you home. Mom's been cooking all morning." "The hospital first," Iris said. "To see Dad." Chloe's smile twitched. Her eyes cut toward Liam. He nodded rapidly, the eagerness spilling over into something almost frantic. Yes, of course. Hospital first. Dad's been waiting for you. County Hospital, 6th floor. Neurology. The hallway smelled of disinfectant and old cotton and the particular staleness of buildings where hope came to wait. Liam pushed open the door to the ward, and Iris stood in the doorway for a long moment, gathering herself, before stepping inside. By the window, curled small against white sheets, lay an old man. His hair, what was left of it, had been shaved close to the scalp, revealing patches of pale, papery skin. The left side of his face sagged, the muscles gone slack, a thin line of saliva tracing from the corner of his mouth to the folded towel someone had tucked beneath his cheek. His right hand, the only part of him that still seemed to belong to the man she remembered, lay on top of the blanket, skeletal, spotted with age, and 4-line taped to the back of it. Iris stopped mid-step. In her memory, Robert Chen was a man of volume. A man whose voice could shake the walls, whose palm could crack an enamel mug against a stone table. A man who stood in a courtyard and roared at his daughter to never come back. Not this. Not this crumpled figure drowning in a hospital gown, fighting for every breath. Margaret sat on a low stool beside the bed, her back curved, her hair more white than black now. When she saw Iris, her whole body gave a violent start. She stood, staggered 2 steps forward, then stopped as though yanked back by invisible hands. Her mouth opened. Her lips trembled. Tears spilled down her cheeks, silent, unstoppable. Iris. Iris walked to the bedside. Robert's eyes moved toward her, slow and milky, the irises clouded like old broth. He stared at her for a long time, as if trying to place a face in a fogged photograph. Then he found her. His throat released a long, rattling moan, the sound of something long blocked suddenly breaking loose. His right arm lifted off the blanket, the 4-line pulling taut, his fingers curling and uncurling spasmodically, reaching. Tears, thick, cloudy, spilled from the corners of his eyes and ran into his ears. His cracked lips worked furiously. From somewhere deep in his ruined throat, he dragged up a sound, mangled and barely human, a word he was throwing every last shred of his strength against. Iris. I'm SSOR. He couldn't finish it. The word was too large. It sat in his throat like a stone, and all his strength could only chip fragments from its edges. He gave up on speech. He grabbed her hand instead, a desperate, clawing grip, and pressed the back of it to his forehead. It was an old gesture, one she remembered from childhood, the way elders in their town would ask for forgiveness, the wrongdoer touching their brow to the wronged one's knuckles. He held her hand there, his eyes squeezed shut, his shoulders jerking with silent sobs. Iris stood motionless, looking down at the shaking shoulders of her father. She had thought she might cry. She didn't. She had thought she might feel vindication, a cold curl of satisfaction. She didn't feel that either. What she felt was a dull pressure in her chest, not forgiveness, not softening. Something more tangled. Something closer to pity, or its distant cousin. The way you might feel watching a tree that once dropped a branch on you finally keel over in a storm. You don't weep for the tree. But you don't cheer either. A nurse came in to change the four. The brisk efficiency of her movements broke the spell. Mr. Chen's having a good day. Usually he barely opens his eyes. The nurse swapped out the bag, checked the drip, and glanced at Iris with casual curiosity. You must be his daughter. When he's lucid, there's one name he keeps saying. Asterisk Iris. Iris, asterisk, we never knew who that was. Liam hovered in the doorway, his face an unreadable mix of emotions. Behind him, Chloe's fingers were working the strap of her handbag, twisting it, untwisting it. Iris, Liam cleared his throat. With Dad like this, maybe we should go home first. The demolition stuff, Dad gave instructions ages ago. I can explain everything. Gently, Iris pulled her hand free. Robert's arm dropped back onto the blanket, limp, but his clouded eyes tracked her, his lips still moving soundlessly. All right, she said. Home. The old house sat in a narrow alley on the west side of town. The alley was too tight for cars, so they walked, Iris carrying Hilda, her feet finding their way along flagstones she'd memorized decades ago. On the walls, painted in dripping crimson, a single character, demolish. She pushed open the green wooden gate. The paint was peeling worse than she remembered, the brass handle pitted with rust. But the courtyard was still there. The jujube tree was still there, taller than in her memory, its branches heavy with fruit caught between green and red. The stone table beneath it was still there, buried under dust and fallen leaves. The kitchen door stood open. On the stove, dishes had been laid out and carefully covered with plastic wrap. A meal, prepared and waiting. For her. Sit, sit. Liam pulled out a chair, wiping it down with exaggerated care. Chloe, grab some tea. Mom, get Iris some water. Margaret hurried to comply. Iris didn't sit. Liam rubbed his hands together, his smile piling up layer after layer. Iris, we're family, so I'll get straight to it. The relocation package, $950,000 total. The house is in Dad's name. By rights, as the only son, I'm the natural heir. But Dad, these last few years, he won't stop talking about you. Every day. He paused, as if summoning some deep emotion, and drew a printed document from his bag. He held it out with both hands, his voice thick with rehearsed sincerity. This is what Mom, Dad, and I put together. Take a look. Completely fair. She took it. Family Asset Distribution Agreement. The terms were simple. Robert and Margaret would receive $560,000. Liam would receive $350,000. Iris would receive $44,800. $44,800. Out of $950,000. Iris stared at the number. Stared at it long enough that a small, quiet laugh escaped her lips. The sound cut through the room like a blade. Every face changed color. Liam's earnest expression froze. Chloe's fingers widened around her purse strap. Margaret, pouring water, sloshed it over the rim of the cup. Iris. Liam's voice wobbled. If you think it's not enough, we can talk. Dad's medical bills are insane, Mom's not well either, and my business, things haven't exactly been going great. Not going great. She lifted her eyes to his. His gaze skittered away. Who told you? Sophie, right? That bitch, I swear to God. He bit off the words, forcing them back down his throat, and reassembled his expression into something approximating a smile. Yeah. It's been rough. Damon Zhao ran off with the money. Everything went under. The house got repossessed. But that's ancient history. Once this relocation money comes through. Damon Zhao. The name landed in the room like a stone in still water. I looked you up, Liam. County police website. The fraud case, illegal fundraising. Over 1.4 million in damages. Damon Zhao was the principal. You were the third defendant. You got probation. The blood emptied from Liam's face. Chloe shot to her feet. That's a lie. That case is closed. Liam was a victim. And this agreement. Iris's voice stayed level, unmoved. She turned to Margaret. Mom. Tell me the truth. Is this what Dad actually wants? Margaret flinched as though struck. The teacup in her hand rattled against its saucer. She looked at Iris, then at Liam, then back at Iris. Her lips trembled. And then she buried her face in her hands and wept. Iris. I'm so sorry. Liam's face went dark. He shook off Margaret's hand and jabbed a finger toward Iris, the mask of civility finally splitting apart. Enough. His voice cracked into a roar. You came back just to cause trouble, didn't you? 44 grand isn't enough for you. You're living it up overseas, big house, fancy car, husband pulling in euros. You need this money. Me and Chloe, our house got taken by the bank. We're drowning. This is our lifeline. You're supposed to be my sister. What kind of monster are you? Sister. She turned to face him fully. She was half a head shorter. He stepped back anyway. 7 years ago, when you took everything I had and threw me out, did you say, sister, then? You. At the mall. Gold chain. Designer bags. $1,700 purse. I was wearing shoes with holes in the soles for 3 years. And now 44,000 is your idea of fair. Her voice never rose. Each word dropped like a stone into still water. Since we're laying everything on the table, she reached into her bag and pulled out a manila envelope, sliding from it a document clipped and tabbed with professional precision. I've prepared my own proposal for the relocation funds. You're going to hear it. She opened to the first page. Relocation compensation, $950,000. Proposed distribution as follows. Hold on. Liam cut her off. His smile had returned, but it was a different smile now, harder, sharper at the edges. Iris, you seem to have forgotten something. The house is in Dad's name. Whatever share Mom and Dad get, they can give to whoever they want. Right, Mom? He swung toward Margaret, his eyes carrying an unmistakable warning. Margaret flinched, her shoulders curling inward, her gaze dropping to the floor. Iris looked at him steadily. You're making a mistake, Liam. Her voice was quiet. Precise. Like the first crack spreading across the surface of ice. I studied design. But I also studied the law. The Inheritance Act. Section 1127. Sons and daughters, both are statutory heirs of the first order. I didn't fly 5,000 miles to negotiate. I flew here to inform you. Either we do this my way, or I refuse to sign. And if I refuse to sign... She let the silence stretch, watching the sweat bead on Liam's temple. None of you see a single cent. Liam's fists clenched. His knuckles went white. He stared at her as though staring at the largest, most unexpected obstacle his life had ever thrown at him. That afternoon. The demolition office. Mr. Collins, the case officer, surveyed the assembly before him, an old man in a wheelchair, a weeping elderly woman, a son whose face had gone the color of old iron, a daughter whose expression gave nothing away, her tall foreign husband, and a little girl with hair like spun gold. He sighed inwardly. Another one. Mrs. Lindstrom. Mr. Chen. The compensation package is $950,000. Per regulations, all registered stakeholders must sign the distribution agreement before funds can be released. Have you reached a consensus? Yes. Liam shoved his proposal across the desk. Mr. Collins glanced at it, then looked at Iris. Do you consent to this distribution? I do not. She slid her own document forward. My proposal is here. Mr. Collins picked it up. By the time he finished the first page, he was sitting straighter. Mrs. Lindstrom. Are you certain? You're voluntarily relinquishing your entire cash allocation? The room went completely still. Liam's head snapped toward her. Margaret's crying stopped mid-sob. Even Robert, slumped in his wheelchair, lifted his heavy, clouded eyes. The full amount, $950,000, will be divided into 3 parts. Her voice was steady, unhurried, as though she were presenting a design brief to a client. Part 1, $280,000 goes into an independent trust, managed by a licensed third-party fiduciary. All of my parents' medical expenses, nursing care, rehabilitation, and basic living costs will be reimbursed by the trust against itemized receipts, paid directly to service providers. No funds pass through any individual's hands. If Liam wishes to serve as a caregiver, he may. Compensation will be calculated at the standard rate for home health aides in this county. Not $1 more. Part 2. Upon the passing of both parents, any remaining trust assets will be divided equally between Liam and myself. Part 3. She lifted her gaze to meet Liam's. Her voice held no emotion at all. The remainder, all of it, goes to Liam. Are you insane? Chloe was on her feet, her heels hammering the tile. Receipt reimbursement. You want to treat us like criminals. We're their son and daughter-in-law, not hired help. Liam surged up beside her, his face purpling. I don't consent. This is our family money, and you want to hand it to some stranger. A trust? You're 5,000 miles away, pulling strings with some fund, choking us off. Do you think we're stupid? No. She held his gaze. Her voice flat. Featureless. Then I won't sign. And without my signature, the relocation process halts. No funds will be released. To anyone. Chloe let out a sharp, contemptuous laugh. Oh, you're really something. You think not signing stops us? Mom and Dad's share, they can give it to whoever they want. Mom, tell her. She elbowed Margaret hard. The old woman jolted, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, like a fish thrown onto a dock. She looked at Liam. Then at Iris. Each glance was a blade she turned on herself. Mom. Liam's voice bore down. Say something. Tell her where the money should go. Enough. The voice was old. Slurred. Torn from somewhere deep in a ruined throat, pushed out with what seemed like the last reserve of strength in a dying body. Robert's eyes were open. Wide open. Those clouded irises burned with something no one in the room had ever seen, not rage, not grief, but the desperate, terrified clarity of a man who, at the end of everything, has suddenly understood what he spent a lifetime breaking. His right hand trembled. Trembled like a dead branch in a winter gale. He lifted it, slowly, painfully, with the gravity of a priest performing last rites, and pointed at Iris. A sound tore from his throat, mangled and wet and barely human, but every person in that room understood it. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Then he turned his head. Turned it with agonizing effort toward his son. His finger, still shaking, still raised, shifted direction. The trembling intensified. Not the tremor of illness now. The tremor of rage. A second syllable. Short. Sharp. The sound of a blunt knife slamming into a cutting board. Go. The blood drained from Liam's face. Dad, what are you saying? It's me, Liam. He forced a smile that looked more like a wound and reached for his father's hand. Robert jerked away as though burned. The violence of the motion sent him sliding sideways in his wheelchair, his body listing, nearly spilling onto the floor. The nurse and Margaret lunged for him simultaneously. Even as they caught him, even as they struggled to right his twisted frame, his eyes never left Liam's face. His mouth kept forming the word, over and over. Go, go. He couldn't speak a full sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone in that room understood. The old man who'd spent half a year in that hospital bed, who'd let his son and daughter-in-law orchestrate everything, who'd silently permitted that obscene distribution scheme, had finally, catastrophically, woken up. Or perhaps he'd been scared awake. Because anyone with eyes could see what he'd finally seen, his daughter, standing in that shabby office, calmly and irrevocably, had just declared that she didn't want his money. Any of it. Liam stood frozen, a cheat magician whose trick had been dismantled in full view of the audience. The lights were on. The crowd had gone. He was still clutching an empty hat. His face cycled through fury, then panic, then collapsed into something slack and hollow. Fine. The word scraped out of him, raw and splintered. Fine. You win. You're the coldest bitch I've ever met. Mr. Collins cleared his throat. Since the stakeholders have essentially reached agreement, we'll draft the formal agreement per Mrs. Lindstrom's proposal. Everyone, please step forward to sign. They signed. They pressed their fingerprints. When it was Robert's turn, Margaret guided his hand. The old man's fingertip, smeared with red ink, hovered over the paper for a long, shaking moment before it finally descended. The print it left was crooked, blurred at the edges, like a seal eroded by too many years of weather. Iris signed her portion and stood. Iris, Margaret rushed after her, clutching the edge of her apron. You're leaving. Just like that. Stay for dinner. I made your favorite. Braised pork ribs, the way you liked them when you were little. Everything's ready. Iris paused. She didn't turn around. I can't, she said. My plane doesn't wait. She lifted Hilda onto her hip and walked out through the glass doors, Eric beside her. Eric hadn't spoken a word the entire time. He simply took their daughter from her arms as they stepped outside, freeing one of her hands. Then he took that hand in his. Quietly. Firmly. Behind them, Liam stood at the end of the corridor, watching their silhouettes shrink into the elevator. He laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh. It was the sound of a rusty saw dragging back and forth across hollow wood. "Iris," he breathed into the empty hallway. "You think it's over?" The elevator descended, floor by floor. Iris didn't know that at that very moment, in the records room of the demolition office, Mr. Collins was frowning at a set of documents Liam had slipped him just before the meeting. A petition for appointment of guardian for Robert Chen, applicant, Liam Chen. Proposed guardian, Liam Chen. Attached, a mental competency assessment, issued by the county hospital, dated 1 week ago. Conclusion: Robert Chen currently lacks full civil capacity. That wasn't the only card Liam had hidden up his sleeve. That night, in the hotel room, Iris had just put Hilda to sleep. Her phone glowed. A new email. Unknown sender. Subject line, for Iris Chen. The attachment was a photograph. A signed, thumbprinted declaration of waiver of inheritance rights. Her name sat on the signature line in a clumsy forgery, a red thumbprint stamped beside it. It looked convincing. Almost. She stared at it for 30 seconds. Then a small, cool smile touched the corner of her lips. She opened her laptop and pulled up the video she'd recorded on her phone that afternoon, the entire signing session, every page of every agreement, captured in crisp HD. There was Liam, face twisted, scrawling his signature. There was Robert, his trembling hand, that crooked, tear-shaped fingerprint pressed into the page like an act of penance. She backed it up 3 times. Local drive. Cloud. And 1 copy to Sophie. Then she leaned back in her chair, cradling the coffee Eric had brewed, and looked out at the unfamiliar nightscape of a town she'd left behind long ago. "Liam," she murmured. "You really don't disappoint." The next morning, her phone rang. Not Liam. Mr. Collins. "Mrs. Lindstrom. Something I need to tell you. Liam came back yesterday afternoon. Brought some documents, tried to get the agreement overturned. He also slid an envelope across my desk." A pause, freighted with disgust. "A thick one. I didn't open it. I told him to come pick it up himself. In front of you." She held the phone, watching the sky pale beyond the hotel window. "Mr. Collins. Thank you. And, may I ask you for something else?" "Of course." She looked at her own blurred reflection in the glass and spoke quietly. "I'd like to request the official surveillance footage from yesterday's signing. The full session. On a disc. Stamped and certified." A pause. Then, "Done. Come by whenever." She hung up. She changed into a dark gray blouse, pulled her hair into a clean knot, and left the hotel without waking Eric or Hilda. By 9 a.m. she was back in the demolition office. Mr. Collins had everything ready, the certified surveillance disc, stamped, sealed, and the original signed agreement. She photographed every page. He watched her work in silence, offering no comment, no objection. She was leaving his office when she nearly collided with Liam and Chloe in the hallway. 4 eyes met. Liam looked like he hadn't slept. His shirt was crumpled, his jaw shadowed with stubble, his eyes netted with red veins. In his hand, a manila envelope, its edges crumpled from the force of his grip. Chloe looked worse, haggard, hollow-eyed, the kind of exhaustion that goes deeper than a single sleepless night. "Iris." Liam's voice scraped out of him, a smile clawing its way onto his face. "You're here early. Running errands." "Me too." His eyes dropped to the disc and documents in her hands. His pupils contracted. "What's that?" "None of your business." She moved to step past him. He blocked her path with a half-step. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped low, carrying a jagged edge of malice. "Come on. We're family. There's something you ought to know." He slid a photocopy from his envelope and held it in front of her face. "You signed this. The Declaration of Waiver of Inheritance Rights, her name. A red thumbprint. A decent forgery." She took the paper, folded it, placed it in her own bag. "Liam." She met his bloodshot eyes without blinking. "Do you know what the penalty is for forging a legal document with intent to defraud?" Something flickered in his face, a twitch, a crack in the bravado. "Don't try to scare me. Whether or not I signed this," she said, her voice still perfectly calm, "is something we can discuss at length. In court. With experts. On the record." The air seemed to go out of him all at once. He looked like a dog that had lunged for a throat and closed its jaws on a steel trap instead. She stepped past him. At his shoulder, she paused. "Oh, that envelope you gave Mr. Collins. The thick one. I suggest you pick it up yourself. In front of me." His face went gray. She didn't look back. She walked out of the building into full morning sun. Eric's car was waiting at the curb. Hilda leaned out the rear window, waving, her hair catching the light like honey. She climbed in. The door closed. Eric pulled away from the curb without asking where she'd been. He simply reached over and rested his hand on hers. His palm was dry and warm, the touch steady as Baltic timber. In her lap, the disc, the agreement photos, and the forged waiver. 3 items. 3 keys. 1 to unlock. 1 to close. And 1 to nail the door shut forever. Outside the window, the town of her childhood slipped past, frame by frame. Back at the hotel, she opened her laptop and began assembling the file. The signed agreement photos. The full surveillance footage of the signing session. The forged waiver, scanned and annotated. Screenshots from the county police website documenting Liam's fraud case. A legal memo she drafted over the past 2 nights, English and Mandarin, both versions. She typed the final line and leaned back. Eric set a mug of hot chocolate beside her hand. He looked at the screen, at the meticulous arrangement of evidence, and asked, in his unhurried, Finnish accented way, "Preparing for a fight?" She wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic. The chocolate was dark, not too sweet, exactly the way she liked it. "Not preparing." She looked out at the late afternoon light slanting through the window. "Prepared." Eric said nothing more. He pulled up a chair, sat beside her, and opened a novel. The following morning, she took Eric and Hilda to the county hospital one last time. To say goodbye. Robert was propped semi-upright in his bed, more alert than she'd seen him yet. When she walked in, his eyes kindled, then dimmed, then kindled again, a star struggling through cloud cover. She crossed to his bedside. He stared at her, his ruined mouth working. Then his right hand began scrabbling under the pillow, searching for something. He found it. He pulled it out with a trembling grip and pushed it toward her. A passbook. Old. The cover worn soft at the edges. She opened it. The account holder's name read, Irish Chen. The entries began 7 years ago. The first deposit was small, barely $40. Then another, and another, in uneven increments. 100 here. 50 there. 300 once, after what must have been months of saving. Irregular. Stubborn. Never stopping. The last deposit was dated last week. Balance, $17,400. She stared at the number. And suddenly she was thinking of 41,000, the sum they'd taken from her. This was 17,000, saved back. 7 years of spare change and scrimped grocery money, hoarded by a half-paralyzed old man who couldn't even speak her name. Dad. Her voice came out unsteady. You saved this. Robert nodded. Vigorously. Desperately. Each nod a bow. Each bow an apology. Pay back. The words scraped out of him, barely more than breath. Pay you back. She held the passbook in both hands, looking down at the hand that had pushed it toward her, spotted, skeletal, mapped with needle bruises. That hand had once pointed at her, told her to get out, slammed a table and said her money belonged to her brother. Now it was pushing everything it had left across the blanket toward her. Iris. Margaret's voice came from behind her, thick with tears. Your father, these past few years, he's talked about you constantly. He saved every bit of this himself. Wouldn't let anyone touch it. Your brother tried. Your father nearly had another stroke fighting him off. She didn't turn around. She closed the passbook and placed it gently on the nightstand. I won't take this money, she said. Robert's eyes flooded. His throat released a frantic, guttural sound, his head shaking violently. But I'll accept it. She bent down. I'll accept what it means. And she pressed her forehead, very gently, against his. It was the first time in 7 years she had initiated contact. Robert's whole body convulsed. His hand shot up and fisted in her sleeve, a drowning man's grip on driftwood. From his throat tore a sound that wasn't speech, wasn't weeping, but something more primal, a father's grief, damned for 7 years, finally breaking through. He held on as long as he could. And when his fingers finally loosened, one by one, and his sobs faded into shuddering breaths, she straightened up. Dad, she said quietly. Take care. She walked out of the room. This time, Robert didn't call after her. He just lay back against his pillow, and his sagging mouth twisted, slowly, effortfully, into something that almost resembled a smile. The first he'd attempted since the stroke. In the hallway, she stopped. Leaned against the wall. Her shoulders gave one quick, silent heave. Just one. She put the passbook in her bag, wiped her eyes before the tears could fall, and walked toward Eric and Hilda, waiting at the end of the corridor. Let's go, she said, lifting her daughter into her arms and pressing a kiss to her impossibly soft hair. Let's go home. The airport. 2 hours until boarding. They found a cafe near the gate. Hilda lay across 2 chairs, drawing lopsided rabbits on the back of a boarding pass. Her phone rang. Liam. She looked at the screen. Answered. Iris. His voice was different from yesterday. Not angry. Not desperate. Not carrying that wheedling edge of calculated charm. It was a voice she'd never heard from him before. A voice that had been stripped of something. Mr. Collins called me in this morning. I took the envelope back. She said nothing. And the competency assessment, he said I could apply for a new one if I had grounds. But I'd need a reason, and a qualified institution, and money. A hollow laugh. I checked. A forensic psych eval costs over 1,000. I don't have 1,000. She still said nothing. A long silence stretched down the line. Long enough that she almost checked to see if he'd hung up. Iris. His voice had shrunk. smaller than she'd ever heard it. Could you help me find a lawyer?" Her coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. "Not to fight anything," he added, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Just for advice. I need to know, does my probation affect whether I can be Dad's guardian? And those creditors, they show up at the door every week, they..." He stopped. He couldn't finish. She listened to her brother's ragged breathing on the other end of the line. And she thought of him at 5 years old, falling off his bike, howling on the sidewalk with a scraped knee. She'd run over and scooped him up, blowing on the wound, saying, don't cry, your big sister's here," and he'd wrapped his small arms around her neck and held on like she was the safest place in the world. When did that boy disappear? When did he learn to say, "You're my sister, it's your job"? When did he start taking her sacrifices as his birthright? When did he stop calling her Gia and start calling her Iris in that flat, dismissive tone? And now he was calling her Iris again. But it sounded different. It sounded like a man standing in the rubble of everything he'd built his life upon, looking up for the first time and realizing he had no idea how to rebuild. She was quiet for a long time. Her coffee went cold. Hilda finished her rabbits and started on a family of hedgehogs. "I'll have Sophie send you a contact," she said finally. "A lawyer. You can explain your situation to him." "Iris." "Liam." She cut him off. Her voice was steady. "Final. This is the last time I help you. After this, you walk your own road." Silence. Then, "Okay. I understand." Chia. The last word, sister in the old familiar way, the way he'd said it when they were children, landed softly, like a door closing. He hung up. She stared at the screen. Call ended, the word seemed to pulse once and fade. And she thought of that morning 7 years ago, standing at the courtyard gate, her father's roar at her back. She'd walked away and typed into her phone, "You don't have a family anymore." She'd carried that sentence for 7 years. She didn't need to carry it anymore. Not because she'd gotten her family back, but because she no longer needed them to define who she was. She slipped the phone into her bag, and her fingers brushed against something hard and rectangular. She pulled it out. The worn passbook. She opened it to the first page. There, in Robert's crooked, childlike handwriting, scrawled before the stroke, when he still had control of his hand, were 3 characters, pressed so hard into the paper the pen had nearly torn through. "For Iris." And beneath them, in Margaret's smaller, neater script, added later, as if in secret, "Mom misses you too." She looked at those words for a long moment. Her thumb traced the indentation they'd left in the paper. Then she closed the passbook and slipped it into the deepest pocket of her bag. The boarding announcement came over the speakers, "Flight to Helsinki, now boarding." She stood. She helped Hilda into her tiny backpack, smoothing down her wind-tousled hair. Eric lifted their carry-ons, one arm sliding around her shoulders with the easy, wordless intimacy of years. Outside the window, the plane glided into position on the tarmac, its wings catching the midday sun. Her phone buzzed. A message from Sophie. Iris. "Your brother came to the hospital this afternoon. On his own. He found the head nurse and signed the caregiving agreement. Then he went to the police station and asked about his probation restrictions. I don't know what you said to him, but he looked different. Oh, and your dad ate more today than he has in weeks. Don't worry about them. I've got it covered, asterisk." She read it. She didn't reply. She locked the screen, took Hilda's hand, and walked toward the gate. The plane lifted off. The ground fell away. Mountains, rivers, farmland, a small county town, an old courtyard with a jujube tree, all of it shrinking beneath the cloud layer, blurring, vanishing. Then the sun broke over the sea of clouds, pouring gold through the cabin window, and she had to squint against the brightness. She thought, some parents treat their daughters like ATMs. She wasn't one. She was her own bank. Some brothers treat their sisters like stepping stones. She wasn't one. She was her own mountain. The wound she'd once thought unsurvivable, the resentment she'd imagined carrying to her grave, time had worn them down, distance had shrunk them, new love had covered them over like fresh snow on old scars. It took her 7 years to understand this. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about finally being free of the past's power to define her. Hilda was asleep in her lap, one small hand still clutching the boarding pass with its crayon rabbits. Eric dozed against her shoulder, his breathing slow and even, his pale lashes catching the amber light. She bent her head and pressed her lips to her daughter's hair. She remembered the girl in that cramped rented room, years ago, folded over a keyboard, shaking in silence, certain she'd been abandoned by the world. If someone had told her then, one day, you'll be on a plane to Helsinki. Beside you will be a man who loves you. In your arms will be a daughter who calls you mama. You'll look back at everything behind you, and then you'll turn away, peacefully, without a second glance, She wouldn't have believed it. But here she was. She leaned her head against the window and let her eyes fall closed. The ghost of a smile settled at the corner of her lips, genuine, quiet, earned. The past was a long funeral. And she had just been born.